Welcome back to our channel. We want to thank you for watching. If you are joining for the first time, we appreciate your time. Here we talk geopolitics on how Africa engage its strategic partner. In this episode, I want to look at the reason why experts from South Africa, researchers, very experienced professionals are coming out clear to debunk a number of these narratives that we've heard over the news media that white South Africans are suffering so badly. Don't get me wrong, South Africa has challenge. I have important videos to play on the reason why experts are coming out very clear, writing articles, making it clear and looking at the data and what the data says. Honestly, based on their own assessment that the white South Africans are not to an extent suffering in the way that it's been perceived in Washington. Actually, if you consider what the President of the United States of America said based on his accusation looking at the country of South Africa.
Mr. President, you said, so on Truth Social, you said that you were going to cut aid from South Africa. Will you plan to cut aid across other African nations, and why South Africa?
No, it's only South Africa. Terrible things are happening in South Africa. The leadership is doing some terrible things, horrible things. So that's under investigation right now. We'll make a determination. And until such time as we find out what South Africa is doing, they're taking away land, they're confiscating land, and actually they're doing things that are perhaps far worse than that.
And also look at how the United States of America Secretary of State made comments with regards to the country of South Africa. And this is important to note that South Africa does have its own internal challenges. However, the people of South Africa must also understand that this particular engagement from the United States of America stems from a whole lot of geopolitical issues, from the Russian-Ukrainian war, looking at the issues in Israel, and more importantly, talking about the position that South Africa took with regards to the war between Russia and Ukraine, and how South Africa has called out the United States to an extent in a lot of other issues.
The U.S. State Department says remarks made by former South African Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool are unacceptable. Rasool was expelled from Washington following comments that Donald Trump mobilizes a supremacist instinct and white victimhood. Let's unpack the story further. Joining us this afternoon is Professor Nikki Falkhoff, Director at the Wits University Center for Diversity Studies, and Janet Jobson, the CEO of the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation. To both of our guests, thanks very much indeed for joining us. I want to begin with you this afternoon, Janet, just given the article that you've written as CEO of the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation about this narrative that's being formed around the persecution of white people, particularly in South Africa. And it's always a good place to start, just because it can be quite an emotional discussion, to start with the facts of the matter, right? And you've spoken about some of those facts in your article. As a start, the unemployment rate of black South Africans, 37%, in the white community, 8%. And you've named a whole range of other examples as well.
Yeah, I think the white victimhood narrative is really, really interesting because it is so disconnected from reality. I mean, if you think about South Africa, most people would consider the Freedom Charter our most radical document, and yet the opening of the Freedom Charter is that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. And so from the outset of the struggle, from the outset of how we imagined freedom, white people were always part of the equation, were always considered equal citizens. And then we've seen how in the post-apartheid period, actually, white South Africans have done incredibly well. In terms of economic privilege, white people continue to outpace all other racial groups quite significantly in terms of access to education. And so the narrative that there is a persecution of white people, I think, is really dangerous. What is important to acknowledge is that white people have had to give up some power, and that can be really hard, but that's not the same thing as persecution.
there is a problem in regards to South Africa's own internal politics based on what's going on regarding the land expropriation issue that South Africa is dealing with at the moment. But for a president of the United States of America to come up and kind of spill it out there to basically cause a lot of confusion with regards to how South Africans have been living their life. South Africans should approach this particular period with care, because comments like this will go a long way to cause a lot of confusion in the country. And we all know South Africa before Donald Trump, they have been facing challenges in a number of areas, but have been working alongside to build their particular society. So if experts are coming out to basically say that the white South Africans are not doing that bad regards to data, who are we going to believe? The President of the United States of America, who basically will make those comments using social media and go over the media and talk about things we've seen experts in South Africa and the media have come out to debunk a number of that particular comment. So it's interesting to understand why this particular narrative is going out there. So it's important that these experts are coming out over and over to show what the data is telling them, that it is not so bad based on what it's out there, because narrative like this could send the wrong message on how a number of people around the world will perceive South Africa's government and the South African people in terms of their interaction with the other population.
And in this context, Professor Valkhoff, does giving up some power perhaps give us some sense into some insight into why diversity, equity, and inclusion are apparently such dirty words in the US?
It's important for us to be able to acknowledge that for people with an enormous amount of power, any loss of power feels seismic, right? When you have 100% of the social pie, suddenly finding that you only have 70% of the social pie feels like you have been really, really hard done by, really abused. And there is this sense of zero-sumness around white victimhood, around ideas of DEI, that as soon as any other racial group does any better, that means that white people are suffering. And of course, we see exactly the same modality happening when we look at problems of gender, where any success that is earned by women, any way in which women, increase their standing in society or increase the sustainability of their financial and economic positions, is seen as being detrimental to the well-being of men. We live in broadly diverse societies. When people do better, when people at the bottom do better, it's actually generally quite good for people at the top. But of course, people at the top can't see that because they are told constantly that a gain for anyone else is a loss for them. And this makes for a hell of a lot of fear, of rage, of anxiety, and all of these very powerful negative emotions play into the social, economic, and political decisions that people make.
So I understand that this is a tense conversation that's going on across the country of South Africa, but South Africans have shown resilience considering their own history, and for this expert coming out talking about that, the information does not reflect what is being heard across the media. And this is why I said geopolitics is a brutal game. An election has consequences. The country of South Africa, to an extent, must come to the realization that it's not going to be business as usual based on their relationship with the United States of America. As the current United States of America Secretary of State, Mr. Marco Rubio, did not attend the G20 of Foreign Ministers meeting that took place recently in South Africa and the Finance Ministers meeting. It is important to know that South Africa does have its own position. As we've seen recently, the United States of America has expelled South African ambassador. But if experts are coming out clear, talking about that the data does not reflect what is going on, that white South Africans are doing extremely well in terms of employment, in terms of a lot of other particular things, businesses, and so on. So this narrative of that the white South Africans are not really doing well, that is as a result playing victim, according to Donald Trump's own comment, it's not really a good narrative to put to the country. I think.
Do you think, Janet, that the U.S. decision to grant people from the Afrikaner community in South Africa asylum in the U.S., that's almost touching on a sort of nerve that is pulsing underneath South African society, and that the U.S. can see that, and for whatever reason would highlight that. And do you think it's taking root here at home?
I think in many ways it's more reflective of the American society. South Africa, as opposed to apartheid, diverse, multicultural society that we are, with all of our complexity and problems, we pose a challenge to the narrative that got Donald Trump elected. Because here we do live together. We live together fine. There's been no persecution. And so in order for America, for the Trump regime to continue to produce the kind of narrative and fear that has prompted his election and that will continue his power, he's got to make it seem like brown people are out to get white people. And that in South Africa, that's what's happening. That has lent into very clear wounds and a sense of disconnection from nationhood that many white South Africans might have, in particular in Afrikaner communities. And in many ways, I feel, as a white South African, in many ways I feel that we've been let down by white leadership. It's hard for me to name a single public white leader who has really shown white South Africans how to embrace being part of this new democratic society, rather than leaning into division or into sort of retreating into our small communities, largely gated ones. So I think there is a pulse that's being hit. I think it's very much within the US. I think it's within the Trump ideology that they have to try and prove that we're not working as a country in order for their ideology to stand. And I think that's why we need to be prouder of ourselves than ever before.
South Africa at the moment is juggling with a number of things. Its relationship with Russia and also China, dealing with the United States, talking about AGOA, talking about most recently the comment from the United States of America's President Donald Trump. So it's just too much for one African country to handle all of these particular issues. So it's important time for the country of South Africa to stay steadfast and focus and see how they can work alongside to resolve these issues, and for the country to come back again and keep working on where they know what to do better. So I think that experts like this coming out talking about these issues, it gives a clear understanding as to the reason why South Africa should understand that the current relationship between the United States of America and the government of South Africa, or the South African people, will pass or outlive the term of Donald Trump. And beyond Donald Trump, the question is what happens next. So it is important to know that if experts are coming out talking about what the data is saying and how the white population in South Africa are doing business-wise and a whole lot of others, I'm not saying there are no challenges in South Africa. There are. But again, if we believe in facts and information coming out, then I think that that particular narrative has no grounds in terms of its engagement or solidifying itself in the country of South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, that's so interesting. And you've written quite extensively about this as well, Professor Falkhoff, the idea of white victimhood, right? And perhaps it's a good place for us to start. And you've outlined it in your article on The Conversation. What does that mean when we say white victimhood? And do we sort of link it in any way to the idea of something like reverse racism?
Absolutely. The narrative of reverse racism is a shining example of something we could think of as being white victimhood. When I talk about white victimhood, what I mean is this particular consciousness that you find in white people in South Africa and elsewhere, where we feel as though bad things that happen to us are so much worse than bad things that happen to other people. So if something bad happens to a white person and something bad happens to anyone else, somehow we are expected to believe and agree that that same thing means more when it happens to a white person. And of course, the ultimate example of this in our context is the myth of white genocide. And the myth of white genocide is based on violence that happens to white people. Now, let's be clear, violence that happens to white people is terrible. No one in this country should be subject to violence. But white people are not the only people who experience horrific and murderous violence in South Africa. In fact, statistically, we are actually less likely to be at risk. But when we talk about violence against white people being a targeted, planned, intentional genocide, because we are such extraordinary victims, because our victimhood is so much more important, what we are de facto saying is that when this kind of violence happens to other people, it doesn't matter as much.
Right.
We're saying white lives are more important and have more value than the lives of other people. And this is this incredibly powerful, incredibly persistent idea that goes back to the colonial era. It's always been part of white identity in South Africa and elsewhere. And it's something that as white people, we need to dismantle, right? We need to think really, really carefully about how we are reacting to pieces of news, how we are reacting to certain situations. Do we experience something and think that it's more important because it's happened to someone who looks like us? This is a massive failure, not only of empathy, but of ethics. And it seems to be, annoyingly, disturbingly, and distressingly, still foundationally part of white South African modes of thinking, not for all people, but for many, many people.
Yeah, and you know, it brings me to the point, it's so funny that you say the death or the persecution of anyone in a country matters, right? And it brings us to the Black Lives Matter movement, and the answer to that in a part of the white community was all lives matter.
Yeah, exactly, as though it's impossible for us to look at the diminished life outcomes and the deep inequality that affects marginalized people in our societies and go, let's make those people's lives better. Mm-hmm. By doing that, we are de facto saying that, oh, then white people's lives are unimportant. Of course, that's not what's going on. But again, it seems that many, many white cultures are so paranoid and defensive and angry and terrified of the loss of even a tiny little bit of the power that they feel should naturally belong to them, that they enact and reenact this horrific failure of empathy, where they are incapable of looking at terrible things that happen to other people and going, this is important, this shouldn't be happening. Instead, all they do is go, well, it shouldn't be happening to me.
Yeah, I think it's that white supremacy infects everyone. It's not just an issue of white people.
Right.
We've set up systems for generations, I mean, from colonialism onwards, that make it seem as if white people are superior, and that gets encoded then in how all of us that live in this society think about things. And so we can see often unthinkingly that we're privileging white lives over black lives. I mean, I often think sort of the example that often comes up is a white matriculant doesn't get into a medical university or doesn't get into university to study medicine. And they are one of many thousands who probably applied for medicine and didn't get a place at one of the universities they wanted. And the question I always have is, did they also apply for the formerly black universities like Sefako Makgato Health University? Did they also put themselves into every possible situation, or do they just expect that the best universities, so-called, are the ones that should accept white people? And I think we've got to make sure we're constantly checking ourselves for these hidden biases that just live in our society. I've got a little 5-year-old, and the ways in which there's a hidden curriculum of our society that encodes, even for a young child, who is poor and who is not poor, who to expect in certain jobs and who to expect in other jobs. Mm-hmm. This is coded deeply in our society, and we've got to work incredibly intentionally to overcome all of that encoding, both as white people and, as Steve Biko would say, we need a black consciousness that also overcomes it from black South Africans.
Certainly. Professor Valkov, I know you have to run. I just want one last comment from you, if you can, on the conversation we're having right now in 2025. Did you think that we would be further on insofar as understanding the impact of our past and understanding that impact on where we are today?
That is such a good question. You know, I feel as though we've made all sorts of strides. We have made all sorts of strides. Society has changed, okay? But what I keep coming back to is the fact that we may have made changes in some of our institutions. We even as individuals may have made changes, but some of the most pervasive structures of society have not changed. So we can make all these arguments for the diversity of our society, which I think are important arguments. We can make all these arguments for the importance of the middle class. We can make all these arguments for South Africa as a moral force for good in the world, which we saw recently, I think, with the ICJ case that we raised. You can go to, I live in Joburg, so all my metaphors are about Joburg. You can go to Sandton and you can go to a fancy restaurant and you can see the most gloriously diverse group of people from all racial groups, all population groups, all over the continent, people who are beautiful and stylish and accomplished and educated. And then you can go to Orange Farm or Tembisa, and what you will see is a hell of a lot of very, very, very poorly educated black people, most of them South African, with very little chance of social mobility. And it's not as simple as saying, the encoding of white supremacy in individual people's mindsets is the reason for the continuation of inequality in our nation, but it is part of it. There are reasons, there are social and personal and cultural reasons that we continue to find ourselves locked in this mess of inequality that we cannot seem to shift. So the top is shifting, the top is changing, the middle is disintegrating, and the bottom is just getting worse and worse and worse and sinking further and further into a pit. So, I may optimistically, if you'd asked me 20 years ago, have thought that things would get better in terms of our generic race consciousness. But I would definitely, if you'd asked me 20 years ago, have thought that things would get better in terms of the level of injustice and inequality in our society, and that doesn't really seem to be happening. We have a program of social grants that is incredible. We have an HIV program that is now been decimated by the withdrawal of American aid, which is a whole other conversation. We shouldn't be that reliant on it. There are elements of South African society that are working very, very hard to make things better for a lot of people. But those of us who do have privilege tend, as Janet said, we tend to kind of hang out in our gated communities and not really actively do that much to make change.
Yeah,
and
certainly.
change is structural, but structures don't change if people don't engage with the structures.
And if people don't want to change, yeah. Professor Nikki Falkhoff, let me thank you for your time. Janet Jobson is the CEO of the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation. To both of our guests, thanks very much indeed. Incredibly important conversation.
Yeah. So I want to thank you for watching. Let me know what you think regards to such data and also experts talking about the information. If you think what the experts are saying is not true, I would like you to drop a comment and leave me your comment below. So I want to thank you for watching. I will be looking forward to meeting you soon in our next episode. Have a good day. Bye-bye.